The venue was perfect. White roses cascaded from crystal vases, champagne flowed like water, and the bride, well, she was flawless. Young, beautiful Celine stood beaming beside Dominic, a successful businessman who couldn't stop smiling at his gorgeous new wife. But in the corner of the reception hall, watching silently from her wheelchair, sat Sarah Harper, Dominic's ex-wife, her divorce finalized just hours before this lavish ceremony. What puzzled the few guests who noticed her was not her presence, but her expression. Sarah wasn't crying, she wasn't angry, she was smiling. A quiet, knowing smile that suggested she was the only one in the room who understood what was really happening. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. 3 years earlier, Sarah Harper stood at a podium in a crowded bookstore, reading the final passage of her latest thriller, Shadows of Deception. The audience hung on her every word, mesmerized by her storytelling. In the front row sat Dominic, her husband of 8 years, watching with obvious pride as his wife captivated the room. You see, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who threaten you openly, Sarah read from the final page. They're the ones who make you feel safe right up until the moment they strike. The crowd erupted in applause as she closed the book. Later, as they drove home in their luxury sedan, Dominic reached across to squeeze her hand. "You know what amazes me about you?" he said, his eyes briefly leaving the road to meet hers. "How you understand human nature so deeply. The way you peel back layers of deception in your books, it's like you can see right through people." Sarah laughed. "Maybe that's why you've never tried to hide anything from me." "Nothing to hide," he replied with a smile. "Besides, you'd figure it out eventually. You always do." Their home was a showcase of their success, a beautiful colonial in an exclusive neighborhood, filled with art they'd collected together, photographs from their travels, and an entire wall of bookshelves displaying Sarah's novels in multiple languages. In Dominic's study, he kept a framed copy of her first book cover beside pictures of them on their wedding day. Sarah's writing studio overlooked their manicured garden. It was here that she crafted the psychological thrillers that had earned her both critical acclaim and commercial success. Her stories often explored betrayal, moral ambiguity, and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary sins when pressed by circumstance or desire. "You write about such darkness," her friends would sometimes say, "but your life is so perfect." And it did seem perfect. Dominic's investment firm was thriving. Sarah's latest book contract had come with a substantial advance. They hosted dinner parties where guests lingered until midnight, reluctant to leave the warm atmosphere of their home. They were discussing starting a family, though both had been so focused on their careers that they'd postponed parenthood into their late 30s. Then came the rainy Tuesday that changed everything. Sarah had been driving back from a meeting with her publisher. The roads were slick with rain. Later, she would remember only fragments, headlights coming toward her, too bright, too close, the sickening crunch of metal, the world spinning, then darkness. She woke up in the hospital 3 days later to the sound of beeping monitors and Dominic's voice, rough with worry, saying her name over and over. When the doctor explained her spinal injury, incomplete paraplegia, a medical term that translated to a life forever changed, Dominic gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. "We'll get through this," he promised. "The best specialists, the best rehabilitation, whatever it takes." For the first few weeks, he was relentless in his support. He rearranged his schedule to be with her during physical therapy. He interviewed home healthcare providers personally. He researched experimental treatments and adaptive technologies. At night, he slept in the uncomfortable chair beside her hospital bed, refusing to leave. But as weeks turned into months, as the reality of Sarah's condition became clearer, she would likely never walk unassisted again. Something shifted in Dominic. It was subtle at first. He started arriving at the hospital later, leaving earlier. He would take calls in the hallway, his voice dropping to a whisper. When Sarah asked about work, his answers became vague. "Just dealing with some complicated clients," he'd say. "Nothing for you to worry about." By the time Sarah returned home, their house had been modified with ramps and wider doorways. Her writing studio had been moved to the first floor. Everything was practical, accessible, and somehow colder than she remembered. Dominic hired a home health aide named Miriam to assist Sarah during the day. Miriam was in her 50s, with kind eyes and capable hands. She helped Sarah with her exercises, with bathing and dressing, with the 100 small indignities that came with her new reality. "Your husband went to a lot of trouble to make things comfortable for you," Miriam observed during her first week. "Yes," Sarah replied, looking around at the carefully redesigned spaces. "He did everything, except be here." Dominic's absences grew longer, his explanations thinner. Late nights at the office, weekend conferences, client emergencies. Sarah, who had always been observant, who made her living noticing the small details that revealed larger truths, began to see the signs clearly. A receipt for an expensive restaurant on a night he claimed to be working late, a whiff of unfamiliar perfume on his collar, The way he no longer met her eyes when he talked about his day. And then there was his assistant, Celine. Young, beautiful, attentive Celine, who had started working for Dominic just before Sarah's accident. Celine, who began calling the house with increasing frequency, her voice honey-sweet as she explained that Mr. Harper had left his phone in the office, or needed a particular file, or had asked her to check on Mrs. Harper. 6 months after her accident, Sarah wheeled herself into Dominic's home office while he was showering. She hadn't come to snoop, she'd only wanted to retrieve a book she remembered seeing on his shelf. But when she bumped against his desk, his phone lit up with a text message preview. "Miss you already. Last night was perfect. Can't wait until she's gone." Sarah sat very still, the phone screen dimming to darkness as she absorbed the impact of those few words. In that moment, something crystallized within her, not just the knowledge of betrayal, but a cold clarity about who her husband had become, or perhaps who he had always been, beneath the veneer of devotion. When Dominic emerged from the shower, she was waiting in the living room, his unlocked phone in her lap. "Who's C?" she asked simply. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of relief, as if he'd been waiting for this moment too. "I think you know," he said, not bothering to reach for the phone. "Tell me anyway." "Celine, my assistant." He sat down across from her, running his hands through his damp hair. "It just happened, Sarah. I didn't plan it. Things like this don't just happen, Dominic. You make choices. Day after day, you make choices. You have no idea what this has been like for me," he said, his voice rising. "Everything changed. Our whole life, our plans, our future, all of it, gone in an instant." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? The difference is, I didn't have a choice. You did." The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty. Dominic admitted the affair had been going on for months. He talked about feeling trapped, about the stress of becoming a caretaker when he'd expected to be a partner. He spoke of Celine's youth, her energy, the way she made him feel. "And how do I make you feel?" Sarah asked quietly. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Guilty," he finally said. "You make me feel guilty." 2 weeks later, Dominic moved out. The divorce proceedings began shortly after. Sarah's lawyer was experienced with high-asset divorces and assured her that given the circumstances, Dominic's infidelity, Sarah's disability, the length of their marriage, she would be well provided for financially. "He wants to be generous," the lawyer said. "The settlement offer is quite fair." "He wants to be free," Sarah corrected, "and he's willing to pay for it." The divorce moved quickly, by legal standards. Dominic was eager to start his new life. There were no children to consider, and Sarah didn't have the energy to fight over material possessions. She kept the house, a substantial financial settlement, and her dignity. What surprised her most during this period was her own calm. She had expected to feel devastated, destroyed by the dual blows of physical disability and marital betrayal. Instead, she felt a curious detachment, as if she were observing her life from a distance, like a character in one of her novels. It was not that she didn't feel pain. She did, acutely. But alongside the pain was something else, a writer's analytical curiosity about how this story would unfold. The final divorce papers were delivered for her signature on a sunny spring morning. As Sarah signed her name, officially ending her marriage, Miriam brought her a cup of tea and an envelope. "This came for you," Miriam said. "Special delivery." Inside was an invitation. Embossed on heavy cream paper were the names Dominic Harper and Celine Montrose, along with a date, just 1 week after the divorce would be finalized, and the name of an exclusive hotel known for its lavish weddings. Sarah looked up at Miriam, who was watching her with concerned eyes. "He's getting married," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady. "Next Saturday." Miriam took the invitation, read it, and made a sound of disgust. "The ink isn't even dry on your divorce papers. This is cruel." "No," Sarah said thoughtfully. "This is revealing." She looked up at Miriam. "He wants me to know how quickly he's moving on, how happy he is, how perfect his new life will be. Are you all right, Mrs. Harper?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. "I'm going to go," she finally said. "To the wedding? But why would you put yourself through that?" Sarah smiled, a small, private smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Because, Miriam, I've always believed that a good writer needs to see the end of the story. And so, on a perfect June day, Sarah Harper sat in her wheelchair in the corner of a hotel ballroom, watching as Dominic married Celine, the young, beautiful woman who had been his assistant, his mistress, and now his wife. The ceremony was lavish, no expense spared. Celine wore a designer gown that emphasized her slender figure. Dominic beamed with pride and something that looked almost like relief. Only a handful of guests noticed Sarah's presence. Those who did exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure why the ex-wife would attend, wondering at the small smile that played around her lips as she watched the proceedings. What none of them knew, not the guests, not Dominic, not even the radiant bride, was that Sarah had recently learned something that would change everything. A secret that would turn this perfect wedding day into the first chapter of a very different story than the one Dominic and Celine thought they were beginning. As the newlyweds shared their first dance, Sarah's smile deepened. In her mind, she was already writing the next chapter. The revelation had come unexpectedly, 2 weeks before the divorce was finalized. Sarah had been working with Miriam on her physical therapy exercises, a grueling routine that left her exhausted but determined. As they finished, Miriam helped her back into her wheelchair and began tidying the exercise equipment. "You're making good progress," Miriam said encouragingly. "Your upper body strength is really improving." Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead. "It needs to. I've got to be more independent." "You will be. You're one of the most determined patients I've ever worked with." "I don't have much choice," Sarah said. "It's just me now." Miriam paused her tidying. "May I speak frankly, Mrs. Harper? Please call me Sarah. And yes, always. I've worked with many people going through difficult life changes. Illness, injury, loss. What I've noticed is that the ones who survive best aren't necessarily the strongest physically. They're the ones who find a purpose beyond their suffering." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know I need to start writing again. Before the accident, that was my purpose, my identity." "Then that's where you'll find your strength," Miriam said. She hesitated, then added, "May I ask you something personal? After helping me bathe for the past 3 months, I think we're past formality." Miriam smiled briefly, then grew serious. "The invitation to your ex-husband's wedding. Why are you going? Most people would find it too painful." Sarah looked out the window for a long moment. "I need to see it," she finally said, "to make it real, to end that chapter properly. And the woman he's marrying, you're ready to see her too? Celine?" Sarah turned back to Miriam. "Yes, I need to see her too." Something flickered across Miriam's face, a brief hesitation, a shadow of unease. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her writer's instinct for human nuance immediately alert. "Nothing. Miriam busied herself with folding a towel. "I hope it gives you the closure you're seeking." But Sarah had caught that moment of hesitation. "Miriam," she said quietly, "is there something about Celine you're not telling me?" Miriam set down the towel and sighed. "I wasn't sure at first, and it's not my place to interfere in your personal matters." "What wasn't you sure about?" "When I first met Miss Montrose, when she came here with Mr. Harper, she looked familiar to me. I couldn't place it at first." Sarah leaned forward in her wheelchair. "And now you can?" Miriam nodded slowly. "Before I worked for your home health care agency, I worked in a private nursing facility in Connecticut. We cared for elderly patients, many of them quite wealthy. There was a woman there, Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop, who had a companion, a young woman who helped manage her affairs, who became like a granddaughter to her. And this companion looked like Celine, not just looked like her, it was her. Though back then, she called herself Caroline Miller." Sarah felt a sudden chill, her novelist's mind already racing ahead, seeing patterns, possibilities. "Tell me about this Caroline Miller, about her relationship with Mrs. Winthrop." "She was charming, attentive. Mrs. Winthrop had no close family, and she grew to depend on Caroline completely. Over time, Caroline gained access to her accounts, her legal affairs. She isolated her from the few friends she had left. And then?" Miriam's face hardened. "And then Mrs. Winthrop changed her will, leaving everything to Caroline. Within a month, she died unexpectedly. The doctors called it natural causes. She was 87, after all, but some of us had our doubts. What happened to Caroline, to Celine after that? She inherited over $2 million, and then she disappeared. A few months later, there was an investigation. Other inconsistencies had come to light, questions about Mrs. Winthrop's medication, but Caroline Miller was gone without a trace." Miriam looked directly at Sarah. "Until I saw her here, calling herself Celine Montrose." Sarah sat very still, absorbing this information. "Are you certain it's the same woman?" "Absolutely certain? Yes. I recognized a small scar on her right wrist, and once I made the connection, I could see it clearly. She's changed her hair, lost some weight, but it's her." "Have you told anyone else? The police? Dominic?" Miriam shook her head. "Who would believe me? I have no proof, just my memory. And the investigation never led to formal charges. It was simply suspicious." "Does she know that you recognized her?" "I don't think so. I was careful not to react when I realized, and she's only been here a few times with Mr. Harper." Sarah wheeled herself to the window, looking out at the garden she had once tended with her own hands. Her mind was working rapidly, connecting dots, seeing a bigger picture emerge. "Miriam," she said without turning around, "do you have any contacts from that nursing facility? Anyone who might have records or remember Caroline Miller? I'm still in touch with one of the nurses, and the facility administrator was very disturbed by the whole situation. He might be willing to talk." Sarah nodded, decision forming. "I'd like you to reach out to them, if you would, discreetly. I need to know everything about Caroline Miller, how she operated, how she gained Mrs. Winthrop's trust, how she disappeared. May I ask why? What do you plan to do with this information? Sarah turned her wheelchair around, a new energy in her movements. I'm going to write a book, Miriam. A novel about a charming sociopath who preys on vulnerable people. A psychological thriller about identity, deception, and justice. You're going to expose her? Not directly. I'm going to tell a story, a work of fiction inspired by real events, and I'm going to make it so compelling, so rich with specific details, that anyone who knows Celine, who knows Caroline, will start to see the similarities. A slow smile spread across Miriam's face. That's rather brilliant, Mrs. Harper. Please, it's Sarah. She wheeled herself to her desk, opening her laptop with renewed purpose. And I need to get to work. I have a wedding to attend and a novel to write. Over the next weeks, Sarah immersed herself in research. Miriam connected her with former colleagues from the Connecticut nursing facility. Through them, Sarah learned more about Caroline Miller and her methods. Caroline had first appeared at Lakeside Manor as a volunteer, reading to residents and helping with social activities. She had singled out Eleanor Winthrop, a wealthy widow with no children, who was still mentally sharp but physically frail. Over months, Caroline had become indispensable to Mrs. Winthrop, managing her correspondence, coordinating her medical appointments, even handling her banking. She was so attentive, remembered the facility administrator during a phone call with Sarah, always bringing Mrs. Winthrop her favorite treats, remembering the names of her great-nieces and nephews, showing her photos from her supposed travels. Supposed? Sarah had asked. Yes, looking back, many of us wondered if anything she told Mrs. Winthrop was true. Her background story kept shifting. Sometimes she mentioned growing up in Boston, other times Chicago. She talked about studying abroad, but never named the university. After Mrs. Applause, Winthrop changed her will, leaving her entire estate to Caroline in place of the distant relatives and charities she had previously named. Things moved quickly. Mrs. Winthrop's health declined suddenly. Caroline moved her to a private room, restricting visitors to reduce stress. When Mrs. Winthrop died, Caroline produced a medical power of attorney document that gave her authority to decline an autopsy. By the time questions arose, Caroline Miller had vanished. The inheritance had been transferred to offshore accounts. Her apartment was vacated, her phone disconnected. The few photographs that existed of her were too poor quality to be useful in any search. I always felt we failed Mrs. Winthrop, the administrator confessed to Sarah. We should have seen what was happening. We should have protected her. As Sarah dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Before Connecticut, there had been rumors of a similar situation in Florida. An elderly man who had fallen under the spell of a young female caretaker who called herself Christina Matthews. After his death, his children discovered that substantial assets had been transferred to her. But Christina Matthews had disappeared before any investigation could begin. It's the same woman, Miriam said when Sarah shared this information. Different name, same methods. And now she's Celine Montrose, Sarah said. About to marry a wealthy man who's just been through a traumatic life change. My accident, our divorce. She's following her pattern. Are you going to warn him? Sarah considered this question carefully. Would he believe me? Or would he see it as the bitter accusations of an ex-wife? Celine has already secured her position in his life. She's cut him off from our old friends, encouraged him to change investment advisors, even convinced him to move to a new house. So what will you do? Sarah gestured to her laptop, where an outline was taking shape. I'm going to tell this story the way I know how, through fiction that reveals truth. The day of Dominic and Celine's wedding, Sarah attended not as a heartbroken ex-wife, but as a writer conducting research. She observed Celine's performance, the adoring glances at Dominic, the charming interactions with guests, the perfect bride persona. She noted how Celine had already isolated Dominic from his old social circle. Most of the guests were her friends or business associates Dominic had met recently. When the ceremony concluded, Sarah quietly left. She had seen what she needed to see. She understood her characters now, all of them, including herself. Back home, Sarah began writing with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The novel, which she titled Veiled Intentions, centered on a character named Valerie, a con artist who assumed different identities to gain the trust of vulnerable people before disappearing with their assets. The novel followed her latest scheme, marrying a recently divorced man whose life had been upended by his former wife's accident. Sarah wrote with precision and psychological insight, drawing on her research into real-life con artists and sociopaths. She crafted Valerie as neither a monster nor a caricature, but as a complex predator, calculating yet occasionally vulnerable, ruthless yet capable of feigning deep emotion. Most importantly, she included specific, distinctive details that would be recognizable to anyone who knew Celine well. Her habit of twisting a lock of hair when concentrating, her collection of vintage perfume bottles, her claim to have studied art history in Paris, her dislike of seafood despite claiming to have grown up on the coast. As the manuscript took shape, Sarah shared chapters with her longtime editor, Elaine, who immediately recognized the quality of the work. "This is your best writing yet," Elaine told her during a video call. "There's an authenticity to it, a razor-sharp insight. Your accident hasn't diminished your talent, Sarah. If anything, it's given your work new depth." "Pain can be clarifying," Sarah replied. "It strips away pretense. The publishing house will be thrilled. You've been missed in the literary world. How quickly can we move on this? I feel a certain urgency." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Is this story based on real events? It feels awfully specific." Sarah gave a small smile. "All fiction draws from reality in some way. I've certainly been thinking about betrayal and deception lately." "Well, your timing is good. The fall publishing list has a gap where another thriller was delayed. If we move quickly, Veiled Intentions could fill that slot." And so, as Dominic and Celine returned from their honeymoon and began their new life together, Sarah's manuscript moved rapidly through the publishing process. Advance reader copies went out to reviewers. Marketing plans were developed. A release date was set. "This is more than a comeback," Elaine told her. "This is a rebirth." For Sarah, it was something else as well. It was justice taking shape, one carefully crafted sentence at a time. 3 months after Dominic and Celine's wedding, billboards featuring the cover of Veiled Intentions began appearing in major cities. The image showed a woman's silhouette with multiple shadows, each taking a different shape, a visual representation of the characters' changing identities. Beneath the title was a tagline, "She becomes whoever you need her to be, until she takes everything you have." The publishing house positioned the novel as Sarah Harper's triumphant return to literature after her accident. In interviews, Sarah spoke candidly about finding strength through storytelling during her recovery. "Writing this book saved me," she told a popular literary podcast. "When everything else was taken from me, my mobility, my marriage, I still had my imagination, my ability to create worlds and characters." When asked if the novel's themes of betrayal reflected her personal experience, Sarah was careful in her response. "Writers draw from life, certainly, but Veiled Intentions isn't autobiography. It's an exploration of deception as both art and weapon." The early reviews were enthusiastic. The New York Times called it a chilling, meticulously crafted thriller that gets under your skin with its authenticity. The Guardian praised Harper's uncanny ability to inhabit the mind of a sociopath while maintaining moral clarity. Entertainment Weekly declared it her most personal and most powerful work to date. As release day approached, Sarah's publisher arranged a book tour modified to accommodate her wheelchair. She would do signings at major bookstores, television appearances, and speaking engagements at literary festivals. The publicity would focus not just on the book, but on Sarah's resilience, her refusal to let personal tragedy silence her voice. Veiled Intentions debuted at number 3 on the bestseller list and climbed to number 1 within 2 weeks. Sales were driven by both critical acclaim and word of mouth, readers finding themselves unable to put the book down, then eagerly discussing it with friends. One aspect that generated particular buzz was the vivid realism of the main character. As one popular booktuber put it in her review, "Valerie feels so authentic that you find yourself wondering if she's based on someone real. There are moments when the specificity is almost unsettling, like Harper has met this woman, studied her, knows exactly how her mind works." Sarah monitored these reviews and reactions closely. Phase 1 of her plan was unfolding exactly as she had hoped. The book was being recognized for its literary merit, its psychological insight, and its almost documentary-like realism. Now it was time for Phase 2. Under a pseudonym, Sarah created accounts on several literary discussion forums and social media platforms. Using these aliases, she began asking subtle questions. Does anyone else feel like they've met someone like Valerie in real life? Or, the details about Valerie's con in Connecticut seem so specific, maybe inspired by a real case? These seeds of speculation took root quickly. Online book clubs began compiling lists of the characters' distinctive traits and habits, wondering if they matched any real-world cases of identity fraud. Amateur sleuths started searching news archives for stories of elderly people defrauded by caretakers or companions. On one popular Reddit thread, a user claimed to have worked at a Florida retirement community where a similar case had occurred. The woman called herself Christina something. She charmed this wealthy widower, got him to change his will, and disappeared right after his death. The timeline matches what would have happened before Valerie's Connecticut con in the book. Sarah didn't need to fan these flames much. The internet's collective curiosity did most of the work. Readers became investigators, piecing together a hypothetical real-life timeline for a Valerie-like con artist who might have operated in Florida, then Connecticut, and might now be somewhere else using a new identity. What Sarah hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly the speculation would move from general to specific. 6 weeks after the book's release, a post appeared on a thriller fan forum connecting several dots. Sarah Harper's ex-husband remarried very quickly after their divorce. His new wife appeared in his life right after Harper's accident. In the book, Valerie targets a man whose life has been disrupted by his wife's disability. Am I the only one seeing the parallel? This post was initially removed by moderators for speculating about the author's personal life, but the idea had been released into the wild. It resurfaced on Twitter, on Facebook groups, in the comments sections of book reviews. Sarah watched this development with mixed emotions. She had wanted the truth to emerge, but she hadn't expected it to happen quite so explicitly, or to involve her so directly. She had hoped the focus would remain on Celine, Caroline, Christina, and her pattern of deception, not on Sarah's possible motives for writing the book. But the speculation continued to spread, gaining momentum when a popular true crime podcast devoted an episode to analyzing the similarities between Veiled Intentions and Sarah Harper's real-life situation. The hosts stopped short of making accusations, framing their discussion as an exploration of how authors transform personal experience into fiction. But they methodically listed the parallels, including the timing of Harper's accident, her divorce, and her ex-husband's swift remarriage. One morning, Sarah received a call from Elaine, her editor. "Have you seen the latest?" Elaine asked without preamble. "The podcast?" "Yes, I listened yesterday." "Not the podcast. There's an article in The Atlantic examining the ethics of using fiction to expose real people. They don't name you specifically, but the reference is clear." Sarah sighed. "That was inevitable, I suppose." "Sarah," Elaine said carefully, "I need to ask you directly. Is Veiled Intentions based on your ex-husband's new wife? Is Valerie a thinly veiled portrait of her?" There was a long pause before Sarah answered. "What I've written is fiction, Elaine. Fiction informed by research, by observation, by my understanding of human nature." "That's not really an answer. It's the only one I can give right now." After they hung up, Sarah wheeled herself to the window, looking out at her garden where the first signs of fall were appearing. The novel had been out for 2 months now. The speculation was growing, but it remained just that, speculation. No one had yet connected Celine Montrose directly to Caroline Miller or Christina Matthews. For that to happen, Sarah needed someone with investigative resources, someone who could follow paper trails and dig into sealed records. She needed a journalist. As if in answer to this thought, her phone rang again. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Sarah Harper speaking. "Miss Harper, my name is Michael Donovan. I'm an investigative reporter with the Boston Globe. I was hoping to talk with you about your novel, Veiled Intentions." Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation. "What aspect of the novel interests you, Mr. Donovan?" "The inspiration behind it, specifically, the character of Valerie and her. Let's call them activities in Connecticut and Florida. I'm always happy to discuss my creative process," Sarah said carefully. "Though I should note that as a novelist I draw from many sources." "Of course," Donovan replied, matching her careful tone. "But in researching some of the scenarios in your book, I've come across some interesting real-world parallels. Cases involving elderly victims and a female perpetrator who seems to change identities. That sounds like promising material for an article." "It does, and given the timing of your novel, I wondered if you might have insights that could help my investigation." Sarah paused, considering her response. "Mr. Donovan, I think we should meet in person. Would you be available to come to my home tomorrow afternoon?" When Michael Donovan arrived the next day, Sarah was struck by how different he was from what she had imagined. Instead of the hard-bitten reporter of her imagination, he was a thoughtful-looking man in his 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a worn leather messenger bag and moved with a careful precision that reminded her of a documentary filmmaker she had once known. After Miriam had served tea and discreetly withdrawn, Sarah got straight to the point. "You think Valerie is based on a real person, a con artist who has operated under multiple names?" Donovan nodded. "I've been tracking cases of elder financial abuse for over a year. When I read your book, the parallels were striking, not just general methods, but specific details that match cases in Florida and Connecticut." "What led you to connect those cases to each other?" "They involve different names, different locations, patterns," Donovan said, taking a small notebook from his bag. "The approach is always the same. Volunteer work to gain access, isolation of the victim from family or friends, rapid establishment of trust, changing of legal documents, sudden decline in the victim's health, disappearance after assets are secured." "And you believe these cases involve the same perpetrator?" "I do, and I believe you do too." He looked at her directly. "Miss Harper, your novel doesn't just describe these patterns. It includes details that were never made public, like the vintage perfume bottle collection that Christina Matthews displayed in her Florida apartment, or the scar on Caroline Miller's right wrist." Sarah kept her expression neutral. As I said, I researched thoroughly. And now I'm wondering if your research extends to your ex-husband's new wife, Celine Montrose. The directness of this statement hung in the air between them. Sarah took a sip of her tea, gathering her thoughts. Mr. Donovan, what exactly are you investigating? A novel or a crime? Both, potentially. The cases in Florida and Connecticut never led to criminal charges. The perpetrator disappeared too quickly, and the evidence was circumstantial. But together, they suggest a pattern of predatory behavior that may be continuing. He leaned forward. Miss Harper, if Celine Montrose is the same woman as Caroline Miller and Christina Matthews, your ex-husband could be in danger. Financial danger? Certainly, Sarah said. Celine has already encouraged him to revise his investment portfolio and change his will. Donovan's eyebrows rose. You know this for a fact? Dominic's former investment advisor is an old family friend. He called me, concerned, when Dominic suddenly transferred his accounts elsewhere. As for the will, Sarah hesitated. Miriam overheard a phone conversation when Celine was here one day. Celine was making an appointment with an estate attorney, mentioning Dominic's outdated will that needed immediate revision. And you didn't warn your ex-husband? Would you believe the concerns of a bitter ex-wife in a wheelchair? Dominic has made his choice. He chose Celine over me, over our history, over everything we built together. So the novel is your warning, your way of exposing her. Sarah looked out the window for a long moment. The novel is a work of fiction, Mr. Donovan. What you do with your investigation is your business. But if you find evidence connecting Celine Montrose to these other identities, to these other cases, I would be very interested to know. Donovan studied her. You're walking a fine line here, Miss Harper. Wheeling, actually, she said with a small smile. And yes, I am. Carefully. Over the next several weeks, Michael Donovan conducted his investigation with methodical thoroughness. He traveled to Florida and Connecticut, interviewing staff at the facilities where Christina Matthews and Caroline Miller had worked. He tracked down family members of the victims, reviewing financial records and photographs. He filed public records requests for everything from property deeds to business licenses. Meanwhile, Veiled Intentions continued its climb up the bestseller lists. Sarah's modified book tour brought her back into the public eye, with profiles in major magazines highlighting her resilience and creative renaissance. In interviews, she deflected questions about real-life inspirations with practiced ease. All fiction contains elements of truth, refracted through the writer's imagination. She didn't mention that sales of the novel were particularly strong in the financial and legal circles where Dominic and Celine now socialized. She didn't need to. The ripples were spreading exactly as she had intended. 3 months after their initial meeting, Donovan contacted Sarah to arrange another visit. When he arrived, his demeanor was different, more confident, more energized. I found the connection, he said as soon as they were alone. From his messenger bag, he produced a manila folder. It took persistence and some lucky breaks, but I have proof that Christina Matthews, Caroline Miller, and Celine Montrose are the same person. He laid out his evidence methodically. A clear photograph of Christina Matthews from a Florida charity event, showing the distinctive scar on her right wrist. Medical records from a Connecticut clinic where Caroline Miller had been treated for that same scar, apparently the result of a childhood accident. School records for a Celeste Montgomery who had left her Ohio hometown at 18, with a yearbook photo showing a younger version of the same woman. Most damning of all, financial records, showing that funds from the Florida victims' accounts had been transferred to an offshore entity that later funded Caroline Miller's credentials as a private healthcare companion. She's careful, but not perfect, Donovan explained. Each time she reinvents herself, she maintains certain patterns. Her first names always start with C. She always claims some connection to European education. She always collects something distinctive like those vintage perfume bottles. These are more than just similarities, Sarah observed. This is proof. Enough for my editor to approve a major investigative piece. We're fact-checking now and our legal team is reviewing everything. But Ms. Harper, he hesitated. Yes? Once this is published, there will be no ambiguity. Everyone will know that Valerie wasn't just inspired by Celine Montrose. She essentially is Celine Montrose. And they'll know that you knew this when you wrote the book. Sarah nodded slowly. I understand. When will the article run? Next Sunday, front page of the investigative section. He gathered his materials. Is there anything you want to say on the record about your knowledge of these connections? Only that as a novelist, I observe, I research, I imagine. If reality and fiction sometimes converge, that's the mystery of creativity. As he prepared to leave, Donovan paused at the door. Miss Harper, Sarah, what you've done here, using a novel to bring a predator to light, it's unorthodox, but effective. I just hope you're prepared for the fallout. Mr. Donovan, when my husband left me for a woman half my age mere months after I became paralyzed, I learned something important about fallout. Sometimes, it reveals what was hidden. Sometimes, it clears the air. After he left, Sarah wheeled herself to her writing desk and opened her laptop. She had started a new novel, but that wasn't what she wanted to work on now. Instead, she opened a new document and began typing. To Dominic, by the time you read this, you will likely have seen Michael Donovan's article in the Boston Globe. You will be angry, confused, possibly in denial. You will want to believe that I orchestrated all of this out of bitterness or revenge. The truth is both simpler and more complex. I wrote Veiled Intentions because it's what I do. I observe human nature and craft narratives that reveal deeper truths. In Celine, I recognized a predator whose pattern was so clear to me that I couldn't ignore it. I could have warned you directly. Perhaps I should have, but would you have listened? Or would you have seen only a bitter ex-wife, trying to sabotage your happiness? I don't expect forgiveness or understanding. I don't want reconciliation. What I want, what I've always wanted, is for the truth to be known. Sarah, she saved the document but didn't send it. Not yet. First, she needed to see how events would unfold when Donovan's article hit the newsstands. When Celine's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. When Sunday came, Sarah was ready. She had Miriam bring her the newspaper as soon as it arrived, and there it was, the front page of the investigative section dominated by the headline, "The Woman with Three Names: How a Serial Con Artist Targeted the Elderly and Vulnerable." The article was comprehensive and damning. It traced Celine's evolution from Celeste Montgomery to Christina Matthews to Caroline Miller, documenting the trail of betrayal and financial exploitation she had left in her wake. It detailed how each new identity had been funded by assets taken from previous victims. It included interviews with family members of those victims, with healthcare workers who had witnessed her methods, with financial experts who explained how such schemes typically operated, and, inevitably, it explored the connections between these real cases and Sarah Harper's novel, Veiled Intentions. It quoted literary experts who discussed the ethics of using fiction to expose real-world wrongdoing. It noted the timing of the book's publication relative to Dominic and Celine's wedding. What it didn't do, and Sarah was grateful for this, was portray her as a vengeful ex-wife. Instead, Donovan had presented her as a keen observer of human behavior who had recognized a pattern where others saw only coincidence. Her paralysis and divorce were mentioned as context, but not as motivation. By midday, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, it was trending on social media, with readers of Veiled Intentions expressing shock at how closely the novel paralleled reality. Book sales spiked again as new readers, drawn by the controversy, sought out the novel to see for themselves. Sarah waited, knowing that sooner or later, Dominic would contact her. The call came the next morning, his name appearing on her phone for the first time in nearly a year. She let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Dominic. Is it true?" His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of rage. "Did you write that book knowing who she was? Did you plan all this? Which part are you asking about? Whether Celine is a con artist who has targeted vulnerable people before, or whether I knew about it when I wrote the book? Both. Either. Just tell me the truth, Sarah." "Yes, to both questions." She kept her voice calm. "I learned about her past from Miriam, who recognized her from Connecticut. I researched further and found the pattern. And yes, I wrote the book knowing exactly who and what she was." There was a long silence. "Then, why didn't you just tell me? Why go through this elaborate scheme with a novel and now a newspaper expose? Would you have believed me, Dominic? If I had called you up and said, 'Your new wife is a con artist who has preyed on vulnerable people before,' what would you have done? You would have dismissed it as jealousy, as bitterness. You don't know that. I know you, Dominic. I was married to you for 8 years. When you make up your mind about something, or someone, you don't easily change course. You decided Celine was perfect, that she was everything I wasn't anymore. Young, whole, uncomplicated. That's not fair, isn't it? You left me when I needed you most. You married her with indecent haste. You've been revising your financial arrangements at her suggestion. Tell me, has she been encouraging you to distance yourself from old friends? To consider moving somewhere new, somewhere her past would be less likely to catch up with her?" His silence was answer enough. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice subdued. "That's up to you. The evidence in Donovan's article is substantial. The authorities in Florida and Connecticut will likely reopen their investigations now that they know her current identity and location. As for your marriage, your assets, those are your decisions to make. You must be enjoying this," he said, bitterness creeping into his tone, "watching everything fall apart for me." "No, Dominic, I don't enjoy your pain. I never did. What I wanted was the truth to be known. What you do with that truth is your choice." After they hung up, Sarah sat quietly for a long time, looking out at her garden where autumn was giving way to winter. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a complex mix of relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. The story that had begun with her accident and Dominic's betrayal was entering its final chapter. But her own story, her life as a writer, as a woman reconstructing her identity after profound loss, was just beginning a new volume. The aftermath of Michael Donovan's exposé unfolded with the dramatic inevitability of a well-plotted thriller. Within days, authorities in both Florida and Connecticut announced they were reopening investigations into the deaths and financial exploitation of Celine's previous victims. Financial forensic experts began tracing the movement of funds through various shell companies and offshore accounts. Celine herself vanished immediately after the article was published, a disappearing act that only seemed to confirm her guilt. She left behind a hastily packed suitcase at the home she shared with Dominic and withdrew $50,000 in cash from their joint account before her access could be frozen. Dominic, shell-shocked and humiliated, retreated from public view. He issued a brief statement through his attorney, declaring himself another victim of Celine Montrose's deception and requesting privacy. Privately, he began the process of having their marriage annulled on grounds of fraud. For Sarah, the weeks following the article's publication brought a strange mix of professional acclaim and personal scrutiny. Veiled Intentions remained at the top of bestseller lists, now read not just as a psychological thriller but as a real-world exposé crafted in fictional form. Literary critics debated the ethics of her approach, with opinions divided on whether she had pioneered a new form of journalistic fiction or crossed a line by using her novelist's platform to pursue what was essentially a personal vendetta. Sarah did few interviews during this period, declining most requests with a simple statement: "The book speaks for itself." When pressed on her motivations, she maintained that her primary concern had been preventing Celine from harming others, including Dominic. Then, 6 weeks after Donovan's article was published, Sarah received a certified letter. Opening it, she found a legal notice informing her that Dominic Harper was filing a defamation lawsuit against her, seeking $10 million in damages. The suit claimed that she had maliciously and knowingly published false information designed to destroy plaintiff's marriage and reputation. Sarah read the document twice, noting with interest that Dominic was being represented by Wallace Thornton, one of the most aggressive and high-profile litigators in the city. The lawsuit claimed that Sarah had fabricated connections between Celine Montrose and other individuals out of jealousy and vindictiveness, and that her novel constituted a thinly veiled attack designed to cause maximum personal and professional damage. Sighing, she picked up the phone and called her literary agent, who connected her with the publishing house's legal team. By that evening, she had retained Patricia Zhao, a respected First Amendment attorney who specialized in defending authors against defamation claims. "This is actually good news," Patricia told her during their first meeting. "Defamation requires falsehood. If what you wrote about, or based on, Celine is substantially true, that's an absolute defense. But the novel is fiction," Sarah pointed out. "I never claimed it was based on real people," Patricia smiled. "Fiction has always been a vehicle for truth, Miss Harper, and thanks to Mr. Donovan's excellent investigative work, we have independent verification of the connections between Celine and her previous identities. Mr. Harper's lawsuit actually gives us a forum to present all of this evidence in a very public way. So you think we'll win?" "I think Mr. Harper has made a serious tactical error. Even filing this suit keeps the story alive in the media, and discovery will be illuminating." The lawsuit did indeed reignite media interest in the story. Entertainment news shows ran segments titled "When Fiction Becomes Reality" and "The Author's Revenge." Literary panels debated the boundaries between creative expression and targeted character assassination. Social media buzzed with opinions, the majority seeming to side with Sarah as a wronged woman who had found a creative way to expose a genuine predator. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Sarah received another unexpected communication, a meeting request from Dominic's lawyer, Wallace Thornton. Curious, she agreed, inviting him to her home rather than meeting at his office. If Thornton was going to try to intimidate her, let him come to her territory, see her in her element. Thornton arrived precisely on time, a tall man with silver hair and a Brooks Brothers suit that screamed old money and establishment power. Sarah met him in her writing studio, positioned beside the large window overlooking her winter garden. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Ms. Harper," Thornton began, taking the seat she indicated. "I thought it might be productive to discuss this situation directly before we proceed further with litigation." "By this situation, you mean your client's lawsuit against me for writing a novel?" Thornton smiled thinly. "A novel that has caused my client significant damage, both personally and professionally. His marriage has been destroyed, his reputation tarnished by association, and his investment business has lost clients who don't wish to be connected to such a public scandal. All consequences of his own choices, Mr. Thornton. He chose to leave his disabled wife for a younger woman. He chose to marry that woman with unseemly haste, and he chose not to investigate her background, despite warning signs that were apparent to others. What was apparent, Ms. Harper, was your resentment at being replaced. Your novel, and your collaboration with Michael Donovan, constitute a calculated attempt to punish your ex-husband for moving on with his life. Sarah regarded him calmly. Is that the narrative you plan to present in court, that I'm simply a bitter ex-wife? It might be more convincing if Celine hadn't disappeared immediately after being exposed, taking 50-0 of your client's money with her. Ms. Montrose's actions after the publication of Mr. Donovan's article are not at issue in this lawsuit. What is at issue is your deliberate campaign to damage my client. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation, Mr. Thornton. Everything in Donovan's article has been independently verified. As for my novel, it's a work of fiction that draws on research and observation, as all my novels do. Thornton leaned forward. Let me be direct, Ms. Harper. My client is prepared to drop this lawsuit if you issue a public statement clarifying that your novel is not based on his wife, and if you agree to donate a portion of the book's proceeds to a charity of his choosing. Sarah actually laughed. You can't be serious. You want me to publicly declare that Celine Montrose is not a con artist, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and pay for the privilege of doing so? What I want is to resolve this situation before it consumes more of everyone's time and resources. A trial will be messy, public, and potentially damaging to all parties, including you. How exactly would it damage me, Mr. Thornton? I've been quite open about my methods and motivations. I didn't set out to hurt Dominic. I set out to expose a predator before she could do more harm. The fact that my ex-husband is collateral damage in that exposure is unfortunate but not my primary concern. Thornton studied her for a long moment. You know, when Dominic described you, he said you were always the smartest person in the room, but that you could be cold when you felt wronged. I see what he meant now. Dominic left me when I was at my most vulnerable. He married a woman who saw him as a target, not a partner. If my response seems cold to you, perhaps you should consider the provocation. Standing to leave, Thornton delivered what he clearly intended as a parting shot. We'll see you in court, Miss Harper. I hope you're prepared to have your motivations exposed as thoroughly as you've exposed others. I look forward to it, Mr. Thornton. Truth has been my ally throughout this process. I'm curious to see if it will be yours. After he left, Sarah called Patricia Zhao to update her on the meeting. Patricia was unsurprised by Thornton's approach. Classic intimidation tactic, she said. They're hoping you'll settle quietly rather than face a public examination of your motives. But they've miscalculated. You've already put your motivations on display in every interview, every public statement. There's no gotcha moment to be had. So we proceed to court? Unless they drop the suit, yes. And given Thornton's reputation, that's unlikely. He doesn't back down easily. It would damage his brand. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday in early February. As Patricia had predicted, the courthouse was surrounded by media, entertainment reporters, as well as legal journalists, all drawn by the unusual intersection of literature, law, and personal drama. Sarah arrived early, accompanied by Miriam and Patricia. She had chosen her clothing carefully, a simple but elegant navy dress, professional without being severe. As she wheeled herself toward the courthouse entrance, cameras clicked and reporters called out questions. Ms. Harper, do you regret using your novel to expose your ex-husband's wife? Sarah, did you write veiled intentions as an act of revenge? Ms. Harper, how do you respond to accusations that you violated literary ethics? Patricia shielded her from the worst of it, repeating no comment until after the hearing, as they made their way inside. In the courtroom, Sarah positioned her wheelchair at the defendant's table, looking straight ahead as Dominic and his legal team entered from a side door. It was the first time she had seen Dominic since his wedding to Celine. He looked older, the stress of recent months evident in new lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore an expensive suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, suggesting weight loss. When their eyes met briefly, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and something that might have been regret. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, called the court to order. After preliminary statements establishing the nature of the case, she addressed both legal teams. I've reviewed the filings in this matter, and I have serious concerns about the plaintiff's claims, she began. Mr. Thornton, your client is alleging defamation based on a work of fiction. Yet much of what was supposedly defamatory has been independently verified by journalistic investigation. Can you clarify the specific falsehoods you claim Ms. Harper published? Thornton rose. Your Honor, the issue is not whether there are similarities between Ms. Harper's fictional character and Ms. Montrose. The issue is Ms. Harper's intent. She deliberately crafted this novel as a weapon, designed to destroy my client's marriage and reputation. She used her platform as a best-selling author to pursue a personal vendetta. Intent is not an element of defamation, counselor. Truth is the defense. Are you arguing that Ms. Harper's characterization was false? We're arguing that it was malicious and calculated to cause harm. The judge's expression suggested she was unimpressed. Ms. Zhao, your response? Patricia stood. Your Honor, Mr. Harper's complaint fails on multiple grounds. First, veiled intentions is clearly marketed and understood as fiction. Second, to the extent that the novel draws inspiration from real events, those events have been independently verified by Mr. Donovan's investigative reporting. And third, there's a clear public interest in exposing a pattern of elder exploitation and fraud. The hearing continued with technical legal arguments, but it was becoming evident that the judge was skeptical of Dominic's claims. She questioned Thornton repeatedly about specifics. What exactly was false? Where was the demonstrable harm that came directly from the novel, as opposed to from Celine's own actions and the subsequent investigations? Finally, after nearly 2 hours, the judge ruled, I'm denying the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction against further publication or promotion of the novel. Based on the evidence presented, there appears to be substantial truth to the underlying factual inspirations for Ms. Harper's work. While I understand Mr. Harper's distress at finding himself adjacent to this situation, the facts suggest that his grievance is properly with Ms. Montrose, not with Ms. Montrose. Harper. It wasn't a complete dismissal of the case, but it was a significant initial victory. As the courtroom began to clear, Sarah found herself face-to-face with Dominic in the narrow aisle. For a moment, neither spoke. You could have just told me, he finally said, his voice low. You didn't have to do it this way. Would you have believed me? Sarah asked quietly. Or would you have seen it as the desperate attempt of a discarded wife to poison your happiness? He had no answer for that. After a moment, he moved past her toward the exit. Sarah watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. They had once loved each other. They had built a life together. Now they were strangers meeting in a courtroom, the remnants of their relationship tangled in legal arguments and public scrutiny. Outside, the media was waiting. Patricia had prepared Sarah for this moment, helping her craft a brief statement that acknowledged the ruling without appearing to gloat. As cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her, Sarah spoke clearly and calmly. Today's ruling affirms what I've maintained throughout, that the creative work I produced, while fiction, was thoroughly researched and rooted in documentable patterns. My motivation was never to cause pain but to prevent further harm. I take no pleasure in the difficulties these revelations have caused for my ex-husband, who is himself a victim of deception. I hope we can now move forward, allowing the proper authorities to pursue their investigations without the distraction of this lawsuit. As she wheeled herself toward the waiting car, a reporter called out one final question. Miss Harper, do you regret writing the book now that you've seen the consequences? Sarah paused, considering. No, she said finally. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, but I don't regret using my voice to speak truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. That's what writers do. We observe, we reveal. Sometimes, we illuminate what others would prefer to keep hidden. In the car heading home, Patricia was jubilant. That judge all but threw the case out. Thornton will likely advise Dominic to withdraw the complaint rather than proceed to a full trial that he's almost certain to lose. Is it really over then? Sarah asked. The legal battle? Probably. The personal aftermath? That's a different question. Indeed, 2 weeks later, Dominic's lawsuit was formally withdrawn. The court filing cited a desire to focus energies on cooperating with ongoing investigations, rather than pursuing civil litigation. The media treated it as an implicit admission that Sarah's portrayal had been substantially accurate. Meanwhile, authorities in Florida and Connecticut had upgraded their investigations of Celine, Caroline, Christina to include potential charges of criminal fraud, identity theft, and, in the case of Mrs. Winthrop, elder abuse. An international search was underway, though most experts believed she had likely adopted yet another identity and was already establishing herself in a new location, seeking her next victim. For Sarah, the end of the legal threat brought not exhilaration but quiet relief. The vindication of her methods was satisfying, but it didn't erase the pain that had preceded them. The accident, Dominic's betrayal, the collapse of the life she had once envisioned for herself. One evening, as winter began to give way to early spring, Sarah sat in her garden, watching as the first crocuses pushed through the soil, small signs of renewal after dormancy. Her phone rang. It was Dominic. May I come see you? He asked without preamble. There are things I need to say, face to face. Sarah hesitated, then agreed. Tomorrow afternoon, she said. I'll have Miriam here. You don't trust me? I don't trust the situation. Too much has happened. He arrived the next day, looking more composed than he had in court but still bearing the marks of stress. Sarah met him in the living room. Miriam discreetly present in the adjacent kitchen. "Thank you for seeing me," Dominic began, sitting across from her wheelchair. "I wanted to apologize. For the lawsuit, for everything." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked. "You seemed quite committed to painting me as a vindictive ex-wife, determined to destroy your happiness." He sighed. "After the hearing, I did something I should have done months ago. I really looked at the evidence, the documentation Donovan found, the patterns of behavior, the financial trails. It's overwhelming." "Yes, it is. Why didn't you come to me directly, Sarah? Before the book, before the article? Why not just show me what you'd discovered?" "I think you know the answer to that. You wouldn't have believed me. You would have seen it as jealousy, as an attempt to sabotage your new relationship. By the time Miriam recognized Celine, you were already deeply committed to your narrative, that she was perfect, that she was the future you wanted." He looked down at his hands. "I abandoned you when you needed me most. I justified it by telling myself that I wasn't equipped to be a caretaker, that we'd both be better off if I moved on. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was selfish. I saw an easy path to happiness with Celine, and I took it." "Yes, you did. And now everything's gone. My marriage, my reputation, half my clients. The police have frozen accounts connected to Celine, including some of our joint assets." He looked up at her. "I keep thinking about what you said in court, that I'm a victim too, but that's not really true, is it? I'm not a victim. I'm a collaborator in my own deception. I wanted to believe in Celine because believing in her justified what I did to you." Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing his rare moment of self-awareness. "What do you want from me, Dominic? Forgiveness? Reconciliation? I don't know. Maybe understanding. Maybe a chance to make amends somehow. You can't undo what's been done. Neither of us can go back to who we were before. I know that, but maybe we could." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the space between them. "I miss you, Sarah. I miss your clarity, your intelligence. I miss us." Sarah looked at him steadily. "There is no us anymore, Dominic. There hasn't been since the day you decided I was a burden rather than a partner. What you're feeling now isn't love or even longing. It's displacement. Your life has been upended, and you're looking for solid ground. But that ground isn't here with me. You've thought about this. I've had time to think about many things. About trust, about resilience, about the difference between justice and revenge. And what conclusion did you reach? Was the book justice or revenge?" Sarah considered this question carefully. "Both, perhaps. I wanted the truth to be known. That's justice. I wanted you to understand the magnitude of your mistake, that may be closer to revenge. But mostly, I wanted to reclaim my voice, my agency, to transform what happened to me into something I controlled." Dominic nodded slowly. "You always were the strongest of us. Even now, in that chair, you're stronger than I ever was. Strength comes in many forms. You'll find yours again, just not here." He stood to leave, looking around the house that had once been theirs. "I am sorry, Sarah, for everything. I believe you, but I've moved beyond needing your apology or regretting its absence. I've built a new life, a different one than I planned, but mine nonetheless." At the door, he paused. "Your book, it really is brilliant, you know. Even knowing it's partly about me, about us, I can recognize the craft. You've always seen people so clearly." "Not always," Sarah said quietly. "I didn't see you clearly enough, not until it was too late." After he left, Sarah returned to her writing studio. She had begun a new novel, not about betrayal or revenge this time, but about reconstruction. About a woman who loses everything and discovers that the empty space where her old life once stood is not a void but a foundation on which to build something new, something perhaps more authentic than what came before. Her phone chimed with a text from her editor. "Great news. Veiled Intentions optioned for limited series adaptation. Call me." Sarah smiled. The story would continue to ripple outward, reaching new audiences, perhaps even helping others recognize similar patterns of deception in their own lives. What had begun as personal pain had been transformed into something powerful, something lasting. Outside, spring was asserting itself more confidently. In her garden, green shoots pushed upward through soil that had seemed dead just weeks before. Sarah wheeled herself to the window, watching as the world renewed itself once again. The media circus eventually moved on to newer scandals, though the Veiled Intentions case, as it came to be known, continued to be referenced in discussions of literary ethics and creative revenge. The story had all the elements that fascinated the public: betrayal, deception, a disabled author fighting back with her pen rather than her fists, a glamorous con artist who had vanished without a trace. 6 months after Dominic withdrew his lawsuit, authorities in Connecticut announced that they had enough evidence to charge Celine Montrose, aka Caroline Miller, with elder exploitation and fraud in connection with Mrs. Winthrop's death and estate. Similar charges were pending in Florida. Interpol had been notified, but there was little expectation that she would be found, unless she attempted to establish a new identity within their jurisdiction. For Sarah, life settled into a new rhythm. The success of Veiled Intentions had restored her literary reputation and substantially improved her financial situation. She used some of the proceeds to make her home more accessible, installing an elevator between floors and renovating her bathroom for easier use. She also established a foundation to support research on spinal cord injuries and to provide creative writing opportunities for disabled individuals. Her new novel, titled Reconstruction, was progressing well. Unlike Veiled Intentions, this work drew more directly from her own experience of disability and reinvention, though still within the framework of psychological suspense. Her editor was enthusiastic about the early chapters, calling them even more intimate and insightful than her previous work. Miriam continued to work with Sarah, though their relationship had evolved from caregiver and patient to something closer to friendship. It was Miriam who encouraged Sarah to accept an invitation to speak at a literary festival in London, her first international travel since the accident. "You've been hiding away in this house for too long," Miriam insisted. "Your story deserves to be heard beyond these walls." The logistics were daunting, arranging for accessible accommodations, navigating air travel with a wheelchair, managing her limited stamina. But as Sarah researched options, she found herself excited by the challenge. This would be a test of her new independence, her ability to navigate the world in its shifted form. The literary festival had scheduled her for a featured session titled Truth in Fiction, When Literature Exposes Reality. The organizers had been transparent about their interest in the controversy surrounding Veiled Intentions, but had also expressed genuine admiration for the literary merits of the work. Sarah prepared carefully, anticipating difficult questions about her motives and methods. The event was held in a historic venue that had been retrofitted for accessibility, not perfectly, but adequately. As Sarah wheeled herself onto the stage, she was greeted by a capacity crowd. The moderator, a respected British literary critic, began by discussing the technical aspects of the novel, its pacing, its psychological acuity, its narrative structure. Only after establishing its merits as literature did she turn to the controversy. "Harper, your novel has been described variously as an act of justice, an act of revenge, and an act of literary boundary crossing. How do you view it?" Sarah considered her response carefully. "I view it primarily as an act of transformation. I took circumstances that could have destroyed me, physical disability, marital betrayal, profound loss, and transformed them into a creative work that has resonance beyond my personal experience. But you must have anticipated the real-world consequences when you incorporated such specific details about your ex-husband's new wife. I anticipated that truth has a way of emerging, especially when it's been deliberately concealed. The fact that Celine Montrose had established a pattern of preying on vulnerable individuals was not my invention. It was reality, documented through careful research. That the novel accelerated the discovery of this pattern is perhaps a testament to fiction's power to illuminate truth. Some critics have suggested that using fiction as a vehicle for what amounts to a personal exposé crosses an ethical line. How do you respond to that? Literature has always engaged with uncomfortable truths. From Dickens exposing workhouse conditions to Sinclair revealing meatpacking industry practices, fiction has a long history of making the invisible visible. My approach was perhaps more personal, but the principle is the same: to use story as a means of illumination. The questions continued, some challenging, some supportive. Sarah answered with thoughtful precision, neither apologizing for her methods nor gloating about their effectiveness. When a young woman in the audience asked if she had any regrets, Sarah paused before responding. "I regret the circumstances that made the book necessary. I regret that my ex-husband was collateral damage in the exposure of a predator, but I don't regret using my voice, my craft, to bring truth to light. As a novelist, that's my responsibility, to see clearly and to share that vision, however uncomfortable it might be." The session ended with sustained applause. As Sarah left the stage, a line formed of people waiting to have their books signed. Many shared personal stories of betrayal, of illness, of rebuilding after loss. One woman, using a cane, leaned close to whisper, "You showed us that disability doesn't mean powerlessness. Thank you for that." Later, in her hotel room, Sarah received an email from her literary agent. Netflix was interested in adapting Veiled Intentions as a limited series, with a respected screenwriter already attached. The project would explore not just the events of the novel but the story behind it: Sarah's accident, Dominic's betrayal, the writing of the book, and the subsequent unmasking of Celine. "They want you as a consultant," her agent wrote. "Full creative input, and the money is very good." Sarah smiled at the irony. The story she had crafted as a response to personal tragedy was taking on a life of its own, expanding into new forms, reaching wider audiences. Her private pain had become public art, then public discourse, and now would become visual storytelling. She replied, accepting the offer, with one condition, that the adaptation include a substantive exploration of disability and its impacts, not as inspiration porn but as lived reality. "I'm not interested in being portrayed as a hero overcoming adversity," she wrote. "I want the complexity shown. The physical challenges, yes, but also the social barriers, the assumptions, the ways in which the world is designed for bodies unlike mine." The following morning, before leaving London, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Michael Donovan, the investigative journalist whose work had corroborated the connections she had woven into her novel. "I thought you'd want to know," he said after they'd exchanged greetings. "Celine's been located." Sarah's heart beat faster. Where? Vancouver. She was establishing herself as Claire Deveau, a French-Canadian art consultant. She'd already insinuated herself into the circle of a wealthy widow with an impressive art collection. How was she caught? Someone recognized her from a news story about the charges in Connecticut. "Apparently, your book is quite popular in Vancouver's book clubs." A friend of the widow made the connection and contacted authorities. Will she be extradited? That's the legal battle now. Her attorney is fighting it, but the Canadian authorities are cooperating with the U.S. investigation. It looks like she'll face charges in at least 2 states, possibly more as other potential victims are identified. After they hung up, Sarah sat by the hotel window, looking out at the London skyline. It was raining lightly, the city gleaming under a thin sheen of water. Celine's capture brought a sense of closure, though not the triumph or vindication she might once have expected. Instead, what she felt was a quiet satisfaction that the pattern had been broken, that the woman who had moved so seamlessly from victim to victim had finally been stopped. Her phone chimed with a text message. It was from Dominic. "Just heard about Celine. Thought you should know. The forensic accountants found evidence she was already planning her exit strategy. Accounts in her name that I didn't know about. A lease on an apartment in Vancouver. She would have left me too, eventually. You didn't just expose her. You saved me from worse." Sarah didn't reply immediately. Their communication since his apology visit had been minimal. A few texts about practical matters related to their financial separation. Nothing personal. This message was different, an acknowledgement of the service she had inadvertently performed for him. Finally, she texted back, "I'm glad the truth is fully known now. Take care of yourself, Dominic." His response came quickly. "You too, Sarah, and thank you for everything." Back home in the States, Sarah threw herself into preparations for the Netflix adaptation. She worked closely with the screenwriter, sharing insights and materials, helping to shape a narrative that would be both dramatically compelling and emotionally honest. The process was healing in its way, revisiting her experiences with the benefit of distance, seeing them refracted through another creative mind. Meanwhile, reconstruction was taking shape as perhaps her most personal work yet. The novel centered on a woman navigating life after a spinal cord injury, but it wasn't merely autobiographical. It explored themes of adaptation, of recalibrating expectations, of finding beauty and meaning in a life that had taken an unexpected turn. One passage in particular captured Sarah's evolved philosophy. What they don't tell you about catastrophic change is that it doesn't just break you, it reveals you, strips away the comfortable illusions, the roles you've played, the identities you've assumed. What remains may be less, in some measurable ways, but in others, it's more authentic, more essential. The parts of yourself that matter most become impossible to ignore when everything extraneous has been burned away. Nearly 2 years after the publication of Veiled Intentions, Sarah attended the premiere of the Netflix adaptation. She wore a custom-designed dress that accommodated her wheelchair, while still making her feel elegant and confident. The red carpet included a ramp, a small accommodation that the producers had insisted upon without Sarah having to ask. Reporters called out questions as she wheeled along the carpet, most focused on the adaptation, but one asked about Celine, who had recently been extradited to face charges in Connecticut. "Ms. Harper, do you feel vindicated by Celine Montrose's prosecution?" Sarah paused, considering. This isn't about vindication, it's about accountability. Ms. Montrose made choices that harmed vulnerable people. Those choices have consequences. That's not vengeance, it's justice. Inside, before the screening began, Sarah found herself seated next to the actress who portrayed her in the series, a talented woman who had spent months learning how to authentically represent life with paraplegia. "I hope I've done justice to your story," the actress said earnestly. "It's not just my story anymore," Sarah replied. "It belongs partly to everyone who sees it now, everyone who finds something of themselves in it." As the lights dimmed and the opening scenes began, Sarah felt a surprising sense of peace. The events portrayed on screen, her accident, Dominic's betrayal, her discovery of Celine's true nature, were no longer open wounds. They had been transformed, first through her writing and now through this visual retelling, into a narrative with meaning beyond personal pain. After the screening, at the reception, Sarah was approached by a young woman in a wheelchair, a journalist covering the event for a disability-focused publication. "Your story has meant so much to our community," she said. "Not because you overcame disability, but because you refused to let it make you invisible." "That was never an option for me," Sarah replied with a smile. "I've always been too stubborn for invisibility." "What's next for you? Another novel?" "Yes, and a memoir, possibly, and some advocacy work through my foundation." "No more revenge novels?" the journalist asked with a knowing smile. Sarah laughed. "I think I've done enough damage with just the one. Besides, revenge was never really the point. The point was reclamation of my voice, my agency, my future." Later that night, in her hotel room, Sarah received a text from Miriam with a photo attached. It showed Sarah's garden back home, where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. The text read, "Life goes on, and beautifully." Sarah smiled at the image. Yes, life did go on. Differently than planned, shaped by losses and obstacles she never anticipated, but with its own unexpected rewards. She had lost a husband but found a deeper sense of self. She had lost mobility but gained perspective. She had faced betrayal and emerged not bitter but wiser, more authentic, more fully herself. Tomorrow she would return home, to her writing desk, to the work of creation that had saved her in more ways than one. The story that had begun with tragedy, with metal twisting on rain-slick roads, with a husband's wandering eye, with paralysis and betrayal, had evolved into something rich and complex and ultimately affirming. Not a happy ending, precisely, but her own ending, crafted with intention, with resilience, with the quiet strength that had been within her all along, waiting for circumstances dire enough to bring it fully to the surface. Sarah Harper's extraordinary journey reminds us that strength often emerges from our deepest wound. When faced with betrayal and loss, she chose to transform her pain into art, using her writer's voice not just for vengeance, but for truth and ultimately, for healing. Remember that, like Sarah, we all have the capacity to write new chapters in our lives, no matter what plot twists fate may have in store.